So get this going. Preparing to live stream the meeting. Please work, please work, please work.
He's like a retired clown.
Right. I like it.
Oh, that's weird. All right. Oh, it's taking me to something we've already done. That's not good.
I was gonna say he's a
Let's see here. Well, that's messed up. Hold on a second.
okay.
That's not good. We should have checked it earlier. I'm so dumb on this stuff. Okay, hold on.
I was gonna say.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, that was me. So it is taking us to last week.
Oh, it is. But Leslie says we're live and good morning and she can see us. Leslie, can you see us?
Okay. Yeah, I can see us now too.
Good morning and she can see us. Leslie. Well, then what am I hearing every once in a while? That's crazy.
Yeah, it's just the link that we have up in the corner is not taking us to the right place, but we are live.
Oh, we are live. Did I say any bad words?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Okay. Now I'm like, wait, what is there to say? How did we start this one? We need to start editing the beginning so we look professional at the beginning and not just like, it's like we ease our way into professionalism. That's not a good look. Okay. So, I'm not seeing the chat though. You're seeing the chat?
I can see it. Yeah, Mary Osterbrock says, I can see you too.
Hi, Mary Osterbrock. It is so good to have you here. I am not seeing it. How come you're seeing it?
I'm going to put here. I'm going to send you the link to.
We're still new at being professional. So, okay, I'm going to click on this.
You know, we've all learned so much in the last 9 months. Like
it's so true.
I'm in the process of sort of editing together our Advent lessons and carols. That's going to happen virtually on Sunday. And I was like, if you had told me 9 months ago that I would be doing this, I would have not believed you.
Like, oh, sure. I get that completely.
Not my strength.
Not your strength, but well, I don't know. Yeah, no, I think what's been fascinating about the last 9 months, as you pointed out, is that within weeks, people who had never done anything technically were like becoming masters of YouTube and figuring it all out, and Zoom and all the rest. They were like, oh, well, I have to learn this or I die, so let's do it now, and then they did it, right?
Yeah.
So Mary's here, and I'm not. Who else is joining us today? Do you see any other names?
Yeah. So what happened? It looks like that we are live on the church's YouTube channel, but we're not live in the event that you had set up.
Well, that's unfortunate. But as long as people can see it, that's all that really matters, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm still only seeing 2 chats from Mary Osterbrock. Do we have anybody else? Anybody else joining us yet? I can't, I envision people like clicking on this later and being like, oh, we'll have to check this out. And for the first 5 minutes, they're like, this is bedlam. What is happening? Why would anyone watch this? If you're with us, say hello on the chat so I know that you're here. How about that?
It says 4 people are watching, but we might be 2 of them.
I don't know how any of that works. Let's just start talking.
Okay.
Mary, it's good to have you with us. We'll see who else joins us. All right, here we go. And Albert's here. Oh, hello, Albert. Hey, Kira. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm all right. It's been gray the last couple of days, and I'm affected by that.
Yeah.
I'm affected by it. And as we were talking about before we started up, like I've been sort of dealing with this sort of the tension of like, oh, it's really cool to know that there are vaccines on the way and we are moving towards a time when we can be back together. but at the same time realizing that the timeline is, 6-7 months away rather than sooner, and knowing like there's a part of us that like we know that it's because of what do they say, user error, right? Like when you call customer service and you think your thing's broken, it turns out it's user error. That's how I feel like that could, like, user error is like, so how I would describe the American response to COVID-19. User error. They were like, have you tried, it's like when they say like, have you tried rebooting? Have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again?
Yeah.
They're like, we're like, this pandemic is out of control. And the customer service person is like, have you tried staying home?
Yeah. Have you tried unplugging it and plugging it back
Right.
in?
Have you tried staying home and wearing a mask? Well, no, but I tried but not believing in it, and that didn't work.
Yeah.
And then I tried believing it was over, and that didn't work either. So I don't understand why this isn't,
Yeah, there's that great like Simpsons line where they're like, we've tried nothing and we're all out of
we
ideas.
tried nothing and we're all out of ideas is genuinely one of my favorite lines of all time. So anyways, by the way, you quoted The Simpsons also in your book. Well, we're going to talk about your book in a little bit. And I remember that episode. I remember when it happened. I was a junior in high school when that episode came out, and it made me really uncomfortable. It made me really uncomfortable because I was I was still like trying to figure out who I was, and I was a very conservative young man politically, and I had left my church, but still kind of my only concept of Christianity was through the church in which I was raised. I wasn't raised in a church where they were teaching us about other traditions. Mm-hmm. And so like them talking about there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, like shocked me as a 16-year-old child. And then the abortion joke, which is a phenomenal joke. That is one of the classic Simpsons jokes. I wasn't mad. I was more just like, I don't even know how to, that's not fair. Like, that's not a good, like and now it's like one of my favorites. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Hey, Betsy, welcome. And I know Kathy Baggett's here too. Welcome. And I think everyone knows my friend Kira, but we're welcoming her back to the show. And so I'm going to say, Kira, why don't you tell us again a little bit about yourself? Easy. Yeah.
My name is Kira. I am an Episcopal priest in Nashville, Tennessee, at a church in East Nashville called St. Anne's, and yeah, that's the short of it.
Who was saying? Okay, so we're big. A lot of the people who watch are church nerds, mm-hmm. and they ask churchy questions. And so, like, who's St. Anne?
Yeah, that's a funny question because a lot of my people don't even know who St. Anne is.
Of course.
And St. Anne is in the tradition is the name of Jesus' grandmother. So
okay.
Mary's mother.
Nice.
Anne. And there's a lot of like church tradition around, the stuff that it's sort of extra biblical.
Like the Immaculate Conception.
Yeah. But
which fits so much into what we're talking about today, I think.
Yeah, so I went to, when I was in the Holy Land with our friend Megan, there were like all of these different churches. There's like St. Anne's in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
One of the stories around St. Anne was that she was actually a very like learned woman and taught Mary to read. And then we went, to Nazareth where Jesus was born. And I remember I asked our guide, I was like, well, like if St. Anne was like, it lived in Jerusalem and like Mary was born in Jerusalem, how'd she end up all the way back here, out here in Nazareth? And our guide was like, don't worry about this too much.
Don't get hung up on the facts of her life. That won't help you at all. That's funny. Yeah. Mary and Joseph, for the poor peasants that they were like the most well-traveled Israelites in the history since Moses, really. I mean, just really well-traveled people. My previous church before I was here was St. John the Divine. And there were people who didn't understand why it was called that and who St. John the Divine was. And then differentiating, and a lot of Christians don't differentiate between John the Divine or John the Revelator, the guy who wrote Revelation, and John the disciple and John the Gospeler. They're all just John,
Yeah.
even though it's a super common name and was then too. But anyways, so we had you on last week. Well, 2 weeks ago. Last week we didn't do this. And then we just talked a little bit, but then I wanted to bring you back, one, because it's just been really fun. It was really fun to have you have a conversation with you. But two, because you have a lot to teach me about understanding abortion as a Christian, because you wrote a book about it.
I did write a book about it.
Look at my copy's dog-eared. Look. There you
Oh,
go.
wow.
I got like, can you tell that things are underlined? And
oh, geez. Wow.
I didn't actually read it. I just went through and underlined some stuff so it looked like I care. No, I'm just kidding. But before we start that, I have a question for you.
Okay.
I noticed you posted something today about starting a new Advent practice, a daily practice. Would you mind sharing it with us? Because this is something we're all trying to figure out, like, and understand how we can incorporate practices into our daily lives in a better way. So what are you doing?
Yeah. So, I don't know about you all, those who are watching or Phil, but like I've been on the struggle bus kind of since the pandemic started.
Yeah.
And it's been hard for me to kind of find motivation, to find focus, to find a routine, given that like my normal routine is sort of upended. I'm mostly working from home, all of this kind of stuff. So for one thing, I will say publicly that I got on a low-level antidepressant, and it has been kind of a game changer for me.
Yeah, you mentioned that. That's awesome.
Yeah, and so around the election, I started it, and I don't know if it has been sort of the resolution of the election for the most part, or the antidepressant, or all things combined. But kind of when Advent started, I was like, okay, like let's get it together.
It's time.
It's time. And Advent is a great time to sort of start. It's the liturgical new year. And given that Advent looks a little different for us all this year, I was like, now is a good time to kind of settle in. I was really kind of thinking, one of the reasons I ended up contacting my doctor about getting on an antidepressant was sort of like, okay, this winter is going to be hard. Like, what can I do to set myself up for success, whatever that looks like, before it gets really hard?
Totally.
And part of my Advent practice has been that as well. So
that's helpful.
Instead of lying in bed in the morning and doom scrolling Twitter and
doom scrolling, by the way,
being anxious about the state of the world and just kind of fretting until all of a sudden it's 9 o'clock and I'm still, lazing around, I have actually started getting up when my husband gets up, and then instead of drinking a whole French press by myself, which again kind of contributes to the anxiety.
I'm going to jitter my way through this problem.
Yeah, like I now make the French press, we split it, he takes his to work, and I drink my 1 cup of coffee while I take breakfast. And then I sit down for morning prayer, and I don't have the book next to me, but the Advent devotional reading from a book called Watch for the Light, which is kind of a compilation of different short-ish readings, sermons from folks like Karl Rahner and Madeline Engel, and kind of Christian thinkers from all across the tradition.
Yeah.
And then I sort of have my prayer time, and then I get ready for the day and sort of start the day. And that has kind of really helped me ground myself and not give in to despair so early in the morning.
Yeah. I had a morning routine that was really, really strong up until the pandemic, and it included getting out the door and going to the gym, and that died, and I have not been able to replace it. And it's 9 months in now, and I'm just not there yet, where I'm ready to give myself to something, which is but I want to, but I'm just not there. And I don't know. I'm trying to be gentle with myself about it. You know what I mean? But it's hard because you want to be good at it, and you want to be good at it for the sake of other people. And, you and I'm guessing you feel pressure like I do to get it right, because when you're a priest, people are watching, and you want to get it right.
Yeah, and I think part of me has been for me has been like part of the morning routine is that it is gentle. I wasn't all of a sudden like, I'm gonna get up at 5:45 now and
Right.
like say morning, pray for an hour and then, lay in the cold backyard for 15 minutes.
You're tapping right into like exactly what I do wrong, which is I'm like, oh, well, I'm gonna start, and then I like create this list. I'm like, when those things like couch to 5K, like I'm like, so today couch, tomorrow 5K, and it's like, no, Phil. The point is to take your time, and I'm like, no, who's got that? Let's be amazing at this. So you okay? So you wrote this book. Because actually what we're about to talk about, what we just talked about in my mind, we're starting in a place where you sort of end in your book. Because in my mind, you end in your book. Your book is called Pro-Choice and Christian, Reconciling Faith, Politics, and Justice. Pro-Choice and Christian, Reconciling Faith, Politics, and Justice. And you walk through, for me and for many others, a really, like, I think it's a really, let me just say, like, here's my 30-second review. It's a really good book. And one of the things that's really good about it, aside from how readable it is, how clear it is you really walk people like me through carefully the thought process of how one might get to where you are. But then it ends with sort of like, oh, and by the way, this is going to require like life-changing, world-changing, like, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven kind of stuff. And so you rightly locate, in my mind, the question of where abortion fits into our picture, into the larger picture of what does it mean to value life, and how do we create structures and societies that value life, that are genuinely pro life and not just pro birth, right?
Yeah.
Why did you write this book? What the hell, Kira? No, but why did you write, like, so tell us, like, you decided to be a priest who wrote a book about abortion. To like talk to us about that.
Yeah, so the process of it was really interesting. Like I never set out to write this book, and I feel a little bit, I have some guilt around being like a published author that did not really seek that out. It sort of came to me.
Yeah.
At the time I was writing fairly regularly for a website called Ministry Matters, which is out of the United Methodist Publishing House. And so I was writing like a couple, 350 to 500 word articles a month. And one month I was like, I'm going to write about abortion because I like mess.
Because I want to cause problems.
I want to cause problems. But I felt that as a Christian who valued, I consider myself a feminist.
Right.
I, think that reproductive rights and reproductive justice is important, but I also didn't see my feelings about abortion sort of represented in the mainstream conversation. And so I wrote a short-ish article about that, and which kind of became the book. It was sort of the book in miniature. And I was contacted by a acquisitions editor from Westminster, John Knox Publishing House.
Nice.
She was like, we've been looking for someone to write this kind of book, and like, we think you'd be good for it. So we met, and I was like, I don't know if I want to do this.
Yeah. No, I absolutely not. Yeah.
I was just thinking, I was at a point in my career, such as it was, that I didn't really want to pigeonhole myself or kind of put myself too far out there politically, especially because I'm in the American South. I'm in a more conservative area of the country. And I wanted to kind of keep my job prospects sort of open.
Wanted to kind of keep my career as a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she was like, okay, like, I understand that, and just think about it. And I thought about it, and I was like, well, I'll go ahead and put the, prospectus together and just sort of see where it goes. and we went back and forth a little bit, and they ended up, wanting to publish the book. So,
And you feel guilty about that?
Huh?
You feel guilty about that?
I just, it wasn't like I had worked so hard on this like thing that I thought, really wanted to write, was like a passion project for me. I was like, okay, I guess I'll write this book.
I love it. I think that's great. First of all, the number of times an acquisitions editor has called me and said, like, this thing you wrote is tapping into something we've wanted to publish for a long time. That's happened to me 0 times. So I'm very impressed, but seriously, like, it needs to be talked about. I've never read some of these things that you wrote about, most of these things. And I've certainly never read a book that just talks about first of all, just to read a book that talks about abortion from a Christian perspective. And then from that Christian perspective to also be for lack of a better term, pro-choice. And you talk about the inherent mess of the language between pro-choice and pro-life.
Yeah.
And even that, like for us to address the language around that is really problematic. And by the way, I'm going to keep talking to Kira, but if you're in the chat and you want to ask her a question, you just type that question. I mean, you can also ask me a question, but I'm less interesting in this situation. But as I was reading it, so I mentioned this to you before, but like just for the people who are watching, like, so I grew up, I would say up until much more recently than most people would know, I would have identified as pro-life, in the traditional sense of the word. And I would have found myself in that sort of, except for in cases of rape and incest, although, and definitely in the case of the mother's life.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, like, I grew up in a tradition that was, I remember in 8th grade, being taught about abortion, that it was bad, and that it was murder. You were killing a child, one of God's children. And my teacher, who was a woman, was very much pro-life and was following that line. And I remember someone raising their hand and saying, well, what if a person gets pregnant from rape or incest? And my teacher, she was like, well, I get that that's tragic, but why would you punish the child? And so that has always resonated with me growing up. Like, I was like, that argument, I was like, oh, well, why don't, well, hold on a second. Like it's a really good, like, it's a good argument. It's something worth, you have to think it through. You don't get to just, it's not the end of the conversation, but it's worth like trying to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always come from this place of like, if this thing is a life, a human life, what does it look, what rights does it have? And how does it belong in the kingdom? What does that mean? Right. And you came at this, and we mentioned this briefly last episode, but you came at this from a different angle because you grew up pro-choice already and Christian already. So here's a question. For me, I was taught that being pro-life was connected to my Christianity very clearly. In fact, if there's anything, it's hard to try to figure out how to be pro-life, disconnecting that from your religious experience. I've tried. I've come up with a couple of possibilities, but for you grew up pro-choice and Christian. Did you understand your pro-choiceness as a Christian? Like, did you have to do some work to connect the pro-choiceness and the Christianity that were both existing alive in you? Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would say that I actually did, and that was part of the process of writing the book, or writing the article that became the book, because it was like, I didn't grow up like vehemently pro-choice,
right,
like
right,
I
right.
was like out at Planned Parenthood with my mom or something, but it was just kind of a like, these are sort of women's rights, or this is kind of like just an important part of like what it means to be a woman in the world, and if we want equality, then like these are the things we have to have access to, which I think is problematic, but I get into that a little bit in the book. Right. We can talk about that, but and then I started thinking like, uh, I find this sort of, there are a few thinkers in the sort of what they call themselves sort of pro-life Democrat category, or the Catholic idea of a whole life ethic, that we aren't very good. I mean, as Christians, or as those who might subscribe to that, like, we aren't very good at living that out. Like,
Right.
we're just not. And like Stanley Hauerwas says, like, ideally Christians would be known for not killing our young or our elderly.
Right.
And
And we're like, nah, we'll kill both. That's fine. Right. Right.
but I think these issues of what rights does an embryo have, what rights does a fetus have, what right does a baby have, are kind of intricately tied to what rights do people with Alzheimer's have, or people that with dementia, or elderly people who are no longer productive in the eyes of our society. And that's a thing that I really wrestle with a lot, in terms of what do we say as Christians about who has worth and who has value, and how is that different from what our society and our culture says has value and has worth?
This is why talking about abortion matters to me as a Christian, because the questions it raises are questions that affect every aspect of our lives. And you tap into that in the book. Like, the questions it raises mean, like, we should be asking questions about what we value.
Mm-hmm.
And you tapped into it, like, what we value tells us about, well, it tells us what we value. It tells us, like, is it mirrored with what Christ values? Right? Now, the argument that I'd always heard against what you just said, and I probably argued it myself, was, but let me say, like, I never got into arguments about abortion with women. I would get into arguments with abortion with other men, which is in and of itself just, I can say that, and everyone who hears that, like, is laughing, but, like, that's the reality for a lot of, like, the conversation about abortion that's happening legislatively is historically, by and large, a conversation had among men about women,
yeah,
and babies. But the thing that I was like, the place that I would go to would be like, well, if we care about the marginalized and the silenced, what's more marginalized and silenced than an unborn child that can't speak for itself, right?
Yeah.
But you tap right into a couple things. You go straight for the space of, like, hey, let's be clear that we actually have never had a good definition of when when a human becomes a human.
Yeah. Aquinas talks about ensoulment, or like when.
So, like, when does that happen? You're very clear about, like, oh, historically, that's never been something that's just, that's not a given anywhere.
Yeah.
So the idea of it happening at conception, but you even give, like, several different lines, right? Like, could be conception, could be implantment, could be when you said when the genetic code is sort of solidified, could be when it starts looking like one.
Yeah.
Could be at what has been historically known as the quickening, could be at what, and even the idea of viability is a moving object.
Yeah.
Which for the Christian suggests so my take on your response to that is essentially, like, since it's not clear and obvious, why would we not value the voice of the woman who's carrying that thing within her? And in terms of her, why does she not get a say in when she understands that to be the case? Is that a fair sort of representation of what you say in your book?
Yeah. And I think, as a woman of sort of childbearing age, and as I watched my friends and my family either try to conceive, struggle with infertility, struggle with miscarriages, all of this stuff, I really felt a tension between, like, well, the sort of not historical, but the sort of, like, mainstream pro-choice argument would kind of say, like, oh, you didn't miscarry a baby.
Right.
You miscarried
right.
a fetus.
Right.
And that's not a real person. And I was like, first of all, that's a horrible pastoral argument.
Right. Right. As a pastor, you're fired.
Yeah. And and so I was feeling this tension between like, well, how is it a baby in this instance where my friend or my family member, miscarried and is grieving the loss of this child, but it's not a child over here when somebody wants an abortion. Like,
Right.
how do we hold that in tension?
Right. Right. Now, was that something that kind of, as you began to study this book, because you mentioned to me before that as you began to do the research for this book, that you got, like, there were parts about your assumptions that you made as a pro-choice person that got called into question. Was that one of them?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, just sort of like being a person. I don't know, like being a person and having experiences, and especially as a clergy person who has the blessing of getting to hear people's most awful and trying and difficult moments, and calling some of those like more political assumptions into
Right.
question, I think.
Yeah. You wrote a paragraph. There was several moments in this book that were transformative for me, I think. But do you mind if I read you back to you? Is that okay?
Oh gosh.
This taps into something for me, and I'll read it. No, I think I'll say what, and then I'll read it.
Okay.
Because I want to say my thing and then have you respond to me based on what you already responded. Like, when I asked the question, when we asked the question, what about like the baby? What about the baby, or what about the unborn child, or what about the life there? What about like what we're doing is, men especially, like I said, we're talking about, we skip even past what about the woman. Like, we're talking about society and we're talking about the baby, but we're not talking about the one who carries the child. And the amount of burden that's placed on a pregnant woman, and you mentioned that throughout your book, the burden that's placed on the pregnant woman from the moment that she's engaged in sexual intercourse, the burden's on her before you actually do it, because you have to decide, like any contraceptive thing is going to have to be your decision by and large. The onus is on the woman, and then the pregnancy is on the woman, and then the delivery of the child is on the woman, and then the taking care of it. And so all of those places, women are held accountable, and in many ways that men aren't. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But here's what really killed me. Like, here's what really kind of knocked me down. This is on page 74 of your book. What if we, as Christians, actually, you said, nevertheless, it is the fetus, the innocent unborn, that is in the foreground, never the woman. What if we, as Christians, in our denominational statements, started with women? As Cathopolit suggests, what is the moral status of women? How much right to life do women have? How much personhood? What about their souls? The division between virtuous and unvirtuous abortions invites judgment upon women, most of whom are just trying to do their best in a world that has stacked the deck against them. The average heterosexual woman spends about 30 years managing her fertility, which necessitates time, money, and effort, trips to the pharmacy, doctor's appointments, and so on, all for methods of birth control that are not 100% effective, and yet ill-timed or unwanted pregnancies are treated as a small thing, as if despite our best efforts, women should still be prepared to bear and raise children at any moment, at least if we're engaging in sexual activity. I had to read that like 4 times. Not because I didn't understand it. It was super understandable. But it hit me over the head, right? Of just how centered on maleness my mind is. And our culture is, but it's too easy to talk about the culture. It's much more difficult to just be honest about like myself.
Yeah.
That I feel like I'm thinking about being a crusader for the baby. and I'm not listening to women, centering women, centering you. And I don't know, I wonder if, and you talk, that's not the only place you talk about it in your book, but I'm wondering I mean, you've written it beautifully, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd want to say about how centering women in this conversation can be helpful for us as a way forward.
Yeah, I do want to answer Albert's question.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that for sure.
Okay.
I want to ask you that, and then we're going to come back to Albert's question.
Okay. So kind of as if we're talking about sort of centering me, and I'll just say that while in the process of writing this book, like shortly after, well, about a month before it was to be officially published, my husband at the time asked for a divorce, kind of surprisingly to me. And I was in a position where I was working very part-time as a clergy person at a church without the support of my husband. I did not have a living wage. I did not have access to health insurance.
Right.
And there was a time during that where I've always said, kind of me personally, I would never get an abortion for myself, but I would absolutely support people who come to different conclusions. Yeah. And there was a moment during that where I was like, what if I was pregnant right now?
Right.
Would I still make that choice? And to be fair, like, I have a very supportive family. I have who would not only would support me emotionally, but also financially.
Right. You wouldn't be out on the streets.
Right.
Right. Right.
But that would not be true for a lot of people.
Right.
And so I think having this sort of, I was thinking about this morning, what I might call like an empathic imagination.
Okay.
What would it be like if I were in a different circumstance? And how could I judge someone who came to a different conclusion without the resources that we as a society have kind of opted to not give women and families
in this Christian country?
In this Christian country.
Because that's communism. Don't be a communist.
Right. But this idea of like, you can still do everything right.
Right.
And end up, that was what that realization was for me. Like, here I am. I don't know where I'm going to live. I don't know if I'm going to have a job. I don't know if I'm going to have health insurance. What if I were pregnant right now?
Right. From a guy who just up and decided to bail.
Right. From somebody I was literally married to.
Right. Right. Like you were having the sex you were having was like within the realm of what it's supposed to be.
Exactly.
By these Christian definitions with which we've been raised.
Yeah.
And you talk about that, by the way. You talk about like the idea, like, yes, of course, sex within marriage is meant to be a really powerful expression of love, but that doesn't at all imply that all sex within marriage is healthy or good or even just or good for the woman. But I mean, it's just like the idea that because it's within the confines of marriage, it's inherently good, and if it's outside of the confines of marriage, it's inherently bad. That's a whole other thing. But you talk about that too. I mean, it's all there. Like, all these questions are asked. Like, wait a minute. So I interrupted you. So you found yourself in a position where you actually, for the first time in your life, were pondering the same things that you were writing about other people having to think about.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't actually pregnant, but I did have this, like,
right.
I could have been.
Right.
And I'm an Episcopal priest. I'm a good girl. I've been a good girl my whole life.
Yeah. Right.
And to think like, oh, I could be in this situation, like the situations I'm writing about.
Women can die from being pregnant, and women can die in childbirth, and have often. I mean, it's a thing. So here's I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a woman who's very adamantly pro-choice and very adamantly pro reproductive rights and for women, and was one of the first times I've really just had one of these conversations, as I said, with a woman and who was willing to talk with me about it, and like in that conversation she kept bringing that up, the fact that it's a possibility. Mm-hmm. That And I think men really don't get it, man. Like there is just no threat to our lives in the way men joke about being put out by having children. The way I joke as a dad of 3 of, oh, what the children do to me compared to what they have actually done to their mother. And I'm not trying to be clever, like genuinely what has happened to her body through something she desired and was really grateful for, and is really genuinely like, it is a joy for her that she has these children, that this is a very meaningful part of her life. And also she has been irreparably changed, and not all in ways that we love. And in every single time could have died. And experienced several miscarriages in the process. That's not a secret in our family. We try to be open about that. And I genuinely have no effing clue. I don't know. I mean, men don't carry any of that responsibility. I don't care. I mean, and the argument we've made historically is, but we carry the financial responsibility. But then we hold that over y'all's heads. Like, don't worry, I'll take care of you is not actually comforting. Am I right? Like,
yeah, I mean, especially when like you can just decide to not.
Right. Well, that's so like Jesus. Okay, I want to talk about Jesus for a second, and then I swear we're gonna get to Albert's question. So people talk about, for instance, they use Jesus' words against divorce as a way of like shaming people who've been divorced. But the reality is he's shaming the men. Well, he's not shaming because he is a little bit. He's convicting the men because they can just hand a woman a certificate of divorce and that's it. The woman's out.
He's out. He's
right.
out.
And he's out clean because Moses said. So like Jesus is actually the women are not like the idea that that's equally convicting to men and women is ridiculous. It's much more convicting to the man because the men are in a position where they're able to get out scot-free. And Jesus says, that doesn't work. I don't know who you think you are that you could do that to a woman and think that's righteous. Right? But the other thing I've been thinking about is like levirate marriage. Right? So a lot of people, this is where my brain goes immediately to obscure Old Testament commandments. And but so if a woman is married to a man and she doesn't have any children yet and the man dies, then the brother if he has a brother, is supposed to marry her. And the first male child she has belongs to the firstborn son. And that's a way to secure for her inheritance, which all seems lovely and good so long as you acknowledge that the whole process is set up in a way that doesn't ever acknowledge the personhood of a woman.
Right.
Like the personhood of women is not, and you talk about this, that the personhood of women is not a given throughout ancient texts, throughout scriptures and ancient culture, and throughout.
Not at all.
And now.
So
I mean, would you say we're still struggling with the personhood of women?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think if anything, this pandemic has really solidified that most, we're encouraged to have children and then we get punished for it in sort of workspaces. And how, the people that I know who are mothers right now who are also trying to balance work and, managing their kids' schooling from home and without any outside help are just like completely at wit's end.
Yeah.
And kind of back to your point about the physical effects of pregnancy. I mean, even just looking at the United States of America, which we all pride ourselves on having the best healthcare system.
Well, we're amazing, right?
It's so good. And we have the highest maternal mortality of any developed country. And that particularly affects women of color. I mean, was it, I'm going to forget which Williams sister it was, had a thing about, she almost died.
Serena Williams. Yeah.
Because nobody believed her that something was wrong.
Literally, no one believed her that something was wrong with her body.
Yeah.
This is a place that I think we need to sit with more and do more work on as a like, I want to figure out how we as a Christian community can spend more time in reflection and obedience to God in this area. because the literally your agency over your body is questioned by virtue of the fact that you're not a man. No one freaking questions me about my body. No, I mean, it's just not part of my life.
Yeah.
It's not like they've questioned me and then like my answers. It said it's not even part of the equation. Okay, Albert's question.
Yes.
Have at it.
Okay. Where I'm assuming this is like where I personally draw the line of
Well, I think we should talk about where you do personally, but I think then we should also talk more about like maybe where churches come down, where scriptures do, like just in general. I think we can do general, but I do think you should talk about your personal experience, understanding as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think my hedging line is that there isn't really a line. I mean, obviously birth, obviously, once a baby is out of the womb and is breathing and
right.
That seems to be a fairly obvious, oh, this is a person. It looks like a person. It makes noises like a person.
It breathes and has a heartbeat and does these things, right?
Yeah. I think for me, even though it is a moving target, viability is an important one for me.
Okay.
And that doesn't always mean like viability can look different. I mean, obviously, if a woman in a less developed country without neonatal ICUs and all of the various things, the viability is going to be a little bit later than it may be here in the United States, where we have all this. Or even somebody in a rural county in the United States is maybe going to have a different viability target than somebody who lives in a city with near a major medical center.
Right.
I think what's hard for me to really wrap my mind around is people that sort of say, fertilization is the beginning of personhood.
Well, that's been me for a long time. So what part, let me see if I can answer the questions, even though I'm not sure I don't know where I am anymore. I'm so agnostic right now in this area, not in like a I don't care way, but like in a, like I am reformulating.
Right.
I have traditionally been a life starts at conception person, traditionally. Mm-hmm. So what questions do you have for a person who thinks that? Because you said you can't wrap your mind around it.
Right. So here's where I would ask some questions, because that's a very common phrase.
Yeah.
Life starts at X.
Yes.
What is life?
So, well, okay, Descartes.
I mean, like, that's where I think the issue is. Like, I think that there is the potential for life in a fertilized egg.
Sure.
And that is something that should be
honored. And you talk about that in your book. Yes. You talk about like the fact that whether or not it is a human life at that point, whether or not there is personhood, ensoulment, as Aquinas says, you don't say, therefore it's a mass of cells, who cares?
Right.
It's not the same as sloughing off the skin and like with a, you don't talk about it that way.
Yeah.
You're very insistent in your book that even if it is not a human life at that point, that the potential for life is sacred.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to, because I don't think anyone that's watching yet has read her book yet. And I hope you all read it. I want to do like a book study about it at church. And when we have human interaction again, I want to bring you up here to come visit him. Or we'll do a road trip to Nashville and pretend that it's about that, but we just want to hang out in Nashville. But okay. So for me, this was my argument back in the day. Okay. Feel free to poke it. I'm not going to be offended. Like, conception made sense because before that you have a sperm and an egg, which are two separate things. And a sperm by itself dies. An egg by itself dies or whatever, it has a shelf life. Once those two things come together, something occurs. And given it is able to follow its natural course, those two become one. And in that oneness continues to grow and develop into. And it is a distinguishing point, unlike so many of the other ones, where this thing happens where a life that like this one genetic reality occurs that exists and then is true about that thing and keeps developing essentially until death.
Yeah.
And so that was my thought process, was like, this is the moment when the two become one, we love that, right? There's the poetry of it, where two different genetic strains come together and become one. So then what? Like, I guess, so then to me, that would be the argument. Like, what's the, like, what am I missing?
So we also don't know when that happens. I mean, a lot
Right.
of women miscarry without ever even knowing that they were pregnant.
That's right.
You know, when I think of, and we just have a different emotional reaction. Like there was an issue, this was now, I think several years ago, but there was a big fire at a place where embryos were housed for IVF treatments.
Wow. Okay.
And like 3,000 embryos were destroyed.
Right.
We have a very different emotional reaction to that than we do to say 9/11, where close to 3,000 people died.
Right. Or every day of 2020.
Or every day of 2020. Yeah.
Right.
So there's something.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I get offended. Like it's when you learn about, the more we learn about miscarriage rates,
Mm-hmm.
The more we understand how much more common they are than we first knew, because they're so often, because the majority of miscarriages happen very early on, and women often don't even know they're pregnant when that happens. I think about the punitive things, like in Indiana, when I think it was Pence was behind trying to pass a law where you had to hold a funeral for an aborted fetus, which is absurd and punitive and cruel and frankly evil. But part of what shows that it's evil is they weren't saying you had to have funerals for miscarried children, which goes to show we like, if it's a miscarriage, we treat it one way, but if it's an abortion, like the pro-life aspect can be like, no, that's a human life that must be respected in a very specific way, but we don't treat it all the same. But since you say this too in your book, and I don't like, maybe since we don't know definitively where personhood begins, then like, how do you, like, we want to be careful.
Yes. But
then that's where you go, I think, isn't that the place where you go in the book to saying like, right, since we don't know, why not trust the person that it affects the most and who's given the task of making every other decision for that thing, and whose body it's in, the woman, the mom.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And also, like, because we don't know, like, I think one of the issues with the conversation around abortion as we normally have it is that we really use it as like a shorthand for like a lot of different things. And I think one of the things that I wanted to unpack in my book is like, we're not just talking about abortion. We're talking about, of course, women, but we're talking about what does it mean to support women and families? We're talking about capitalism. We're talking about the medical system. We're talking about all of these different things when we talk about abortion, but it's so easy to kind of reduce things to a shorthand of life starts at conception, or heartbeat bills, or, what is like abortion on demand, is
Well, I mean, so for instance, I mean, the idea, I was raised to be horrified by the idea of late-term abortions. And actually the conversation around late-term abortion wasn't really a conversation, but the specter of late-term abortion on demand, as you said, like it's a pay-per-view or, you
can just order up an abortion.
That was just sort of like a cavalier, like, I don't want this baby anymore thing. I'd never bothered to think it through. And we've had 3 children now, and my wife's been pregnant 6 times, and we've had 3 children. And there's no way she gets to 7, 8, 9 months and is like, you know what? Never mind. And then you look at the stats and you realize when we're talking about late term abortion, we are almost exclusively talking about a medical situation where a woman is having to make a choice between her life and the child's life, or the child is already going to be born to die, or something like that. That is horrific and terrible.
Yeah.
And to categorize late term abortion as, well, all of the language. Here's what I'm struggling with, Kira. All the language I was raised with is female shaming language. All of it, literally all of it. Not some of it, all of it. And you say somewhere in your book, hold on, I think I even underlined it because I was like, yeah. Women are either, it's that idea of it's the Madonna whore complex, right? That women are either like perfect pictures of virtue or like innocence or motherhood, or your whores. Like that's the what, and pardon my language, you wrote that, but like that's the culture. That's not, just for the record, that's what she said, not me. But that's the culture in which we live, that a woman's value by the culture is placed either in your innocence, or your motherhood, or that your value and lack thereof, both at the same time, strangely. Your sexual prowess, which is identified in a negative connotation. But always by your beauty.
Yes.
As perceived by men and what men think it should be.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know this is all like elementary for you, but this is still like, I'm still working through this.
It's good. Like it's amazing the way it shows up. I've gotten deep into the 4th season of The Crown and very deep into sort of the Diana, Princess of Wales story. And I've been listening to the You're Wrong About podcast about that whole thing. And one of the things that one of her biographers, kind of the more negative biographer, talks about is like, oh, like Diana enjoyed sex. Like, right. Oh, I'm sorry, an adult woman enjoyed having sex.
Oh, how unfortunate for her.
That's
what a disgusting reality.
But like, like you're not allowed to, or without compromising your virtue or your, perceived innocence, or you're only allowed to have sex when it's to procreate, or, these are things that even though we know, like, as progressive people who are, wise, and we know these things, and yet they're so prevalent in reporting, in the culture, in the way women get talked about.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Even just kind of thinking back to the way Monica Lewinsky was portrayed in.
While Bill was like, the way that even some of the feminist women that we knew growing up defended him, and that's a whole other thing. But right. But men, it's even crappy that I would immediately go to the way women defended him, because the reality is men just were like, well, duh. Oh, that rascal. Oh, that troublemaker. We got 1 minute left, and you're not going to answer Albert's next question in 1 minute. Will you come back next week?
Yeah.
Can we talk more about this exact thing?
Yeah, there's so much to cover, really.
I also just want to make sure that we talk about other things with you. I don't actually want to make sure of it. This is not your only subject, but This is really important stuff for us to think through. I want to start with the question next week that Albert just asked.
Okay.
And don't worry, Albert, you're not monopolizing if other people don't ask questions. But I'm going to take a screenshot of the question. This is my high technology. Make sure we got it. Okay. And I'd like to start with that question for next week. And then I want to talk a little bit about what it means for churches. I want to talk about churches. I want to talk about church governance. I want to talk about how churches, what does it look like to be a pro-choice church?
Yeah.
Leslie's wonderful. I'm glad you're here today, Leslie. Okay. What have you been listening to musically? What's been your music the last couple of weeks?
So I took your advice and I've been listening to the Ella Fitzgerald piano duets.
Yeah. Did you like it?
I do. I mean, I love Ella. I love Ella.
Oh, good. It's so pure, right?
It's sometimes, okay, I like jazz and I especially like jazz vocalists.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's too
much.
like
you're like, those were too many notes. You didn't have to hit all of them.
But like there's like saxophone and this and that. And like I love just her voice and the piano.
It's helped me because I've always liked her, but I grew up like really digging on Sinatra and which I still do, and Louis Prima and some other folks. And I liked her, but I never loved her. I liked her a lot. But I've fallen in love because the clarity of her voice and her ability, and this album, because everything is out of the way. It's just her and the piano. Right.
Yeah.
That's been really, really meaningful to me. And I've been listening to, like, while I was reading your book, I was listening to a lot of piano as well. I was listening to like a lot of, do you know who Martha Argerich is?
No, I don't think
she's a classical pianist from Argentina.
Okay.
And I was listening to a lot of Martha Argerich. It's weird when you like classical music because there's the composer and then there's the instrument and then there's like the performer.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different ways to be snobby and crappy.
I mean, I'm a trained classical vocalist.
So then you know. So Martha Argerich is a classical pianist, and I've been kind of digging into how she plays, and I've been listening to her, and so last night while reading your book, I was listening to her play the piano. That was not a bad way to go. Okay, I like talking about what music we're listening to. Are you all up to date on The Mandalorian?
I am, yeah.
That last episode, man.
So good. It's so good. Like, I'm not even a Star Wars person, but
you don't need to be.
You don't need to be. Yeah.
You don't need to you don't need to like football or Texas to like Friday Night Lights.
That's true.
Right?
That's so true.
And you don't need to care at all about Star Wars to like The Mandalorian. It's just beautiful television. All right. Okay. We're gonna stop. We're ending.
Thank you all for joining us and listening to me. And I hope you'll read my book. And
we're going to put a link to it. I think we linked to it. We're going to link to it again. I want to talk about next week about like ways that the church can engage in this work and the ways that churches already are. You talk a little bit about where churches denominationally are and what that looks like, but I think we should talk a little bit more about that, where the rubber hits the road for Christians. I hope you have a great week.
Yeah, you too.
And thanks everybody for joining us. We're having fun and we're really grateful for y'all. So now I have to figure out, I want to say goodbye in a way that seems like I know what I'm doing when it comes to turning this thing off. Okay, there we go. I don't know how to turn it off. I'm gonna have to figure it out. Hold on. I literally have no idea how to turn it off, dude. Oh, I got it. Okay. We're saying goodbye to everybody and I'm going to figure this out later.